I could not be more pleased to have my friend Ambassador Grossman speak on this topic. As you know, for a number of years, Mark, this organization has had a program called the State of the State Department. And it usually is looking at foreign policy and what to expect over the course of the coming year. But, you know, it's hard to do that if you really don't know what's happening at the State Department, and you can certainly present that for us. You know, there's a number of articles about this. If you go into the website, go in the internet, and you type in problems, State Department, reforming State Department, everybody has an idea. So let me just read you a few titles. Revitalizing the State Department and American Diplomacy, Council on Foreign Relations. How to revitalize a dysfunctional State Department, Brookings. How to rebuild the State Department, the Atlantic Council. The U.S. Foreign Service isn't suited for the 21st century. Well, we'll get to that in just a second. Then I'm going to tell you about somebody who has really taken this to heart and has tried to, and has really led a number of initiatives on this important topic, and that is, of course, our guest, Ambassador Marc Grossman. I first got to know Mark, and I'll call him Mark because I was head of the search committee that brought him in as chairman of the World Affairs Councils of America a number of years ago. And shortly after he came on, there was a change in leadership. And so Mark called me up one Sunday afternoon and he said, we're going to be attached almost every Sunday afternoon. And indeed, he was an exceptional leader of the World Affairs Councils of America. You know him now as vice chair of the Cohen Group, the organization that was established and still run by former Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen. Mark has had a 30-year career in the Department of State, as have some of our other guests today. He was Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, which is considered the third highest position in the Department of State. He was Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Ambassador to Turkey, and then after Richard Holbrooke passed away, he was brought back into the Foreign Service after what he thought was his retirement to follow Ambassador Holbrooke as Special U.S. Rep for Pakistan and Afghanistan. You can imagine how much fun that job was. So great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
And I'll introduce our other respondents in a few minutes. But Mark, really great to have you in Santa Fe. Sorry we didn't get the hike yesterday.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, what a great room this is. A lot better than yesterday. Thank you very much. Jim, first of all, thank you. I just have to say a couple of thank yous, if you will, before we get into the questions and answers. But first, so let me deal with the very kind introduction that Jim has given. So one of the things that's been interesting to me as I go around and talk about this report that I will tell you about is, so sometimes people who don't know as much as Jim Falk tend to kind of give you all these titles, right? Here, there, 30 years of this, 30 years of that. So the other day I was making a presentation and somebody got kind of lost in all of these titles and finally said, oh, here's Ambassador Grossman. What an extinguished career. I thought, you know, that's kind of how this goes at this stage. So I hope you'll forgive me for that. But first, sort of a couple of thank yous on my part. First of all, thank you to Global Santa Fe. As you all know, these events don't happen without an enormous amount of work. And so thank you to all of those who organized this event and put this event together. So, yes, thank you. Secondly, to Jim, who I will call Jim. If you'll call me Mark, I'll call you Jim. Thank you. Who's been a wonderful friend, as he said, for a very long time. But he holds a very special place in this particular conversation because when we did the first report, the Belfer report at Harvard University, it was the Dallas World Affairs Council that allowed us, first of all, to try out some of the ideas, to make a presentation, to have a lot of conversations with people in Dallas, and then he helped us as part of the rollout of this. And so Jim is part of the family that produced these recommendations. And third, I'd just like to thank George and Wendy Powell, who've been wonderful hosts here and longtime friends of ours. George and Wendy, thank you very much. As Jim said, I'd also like to thank and recognize all of the people in this room, and there are a lot of them who served at the State Department and served their country, people who served in Capitol Hill, served around the government, so thank you. And then finally, thank all of you. The fact that you have come here on a Monday. We filled this room to talk about the State Department. It is, for me, a very uplifting moment. And so thank you very much. We're glad for all of that attention, for all those titles that you read out, and I hope I am, over the next few minutes, able to convince you that we've got something special here, and something special I hope you'll support.
So what we're going to do today is have a few questions for the ambassador, and he'll take it away. And then we're going to do something which they've not done on this report in this way, is we're going to bring up two respondents, Ambassador Deborah Jones, Career Foreign Service, and I'll introduce her a bit more in a second, as well as David Killion, who worked on Capitol Hill. So we'll see just how they view what Marc has to say and whether or not he can defend the report the way he wants. So, you know, I sort of made fun in the beginning about all these reports that were written. And you mentioned the Belfer Center, a U.S. diplomatic service for the 21st century.
Yes.
I'd like to know, Marc, how you got involved with this project with Nick Burns and Ambassador Marcie Ries at Georgetown, and why you think what you have done with your colleagues will be successful when so many of these other reports, frankly, have just sat on shelves.
Sure. Jim, thank you very much. And again, thank all of you. So this idea started in 2019. Ambassador Nick Burns and I were both working at the Cohen Group together. He was also a professor at Harvard University. And we were thinking hard about some of the issues that have been raised in these reports. And like you said, Jim, the State Department is a great place. And the people who work in the State Department are great people. And you should be proud of all of the people who are representing you all around the world today. But the State Department needs some change. And it needs some new ways of thinking. And we thought to ourselves, here we've had these careers. What is it that we could do to offer back something to the people who are serving today and those people who might serve in the future? And so we began to think about some ideas, and we spent 2019 kind of getting ready, and we raised a substantial amount of money, and we had a fantastic plan, like you all had fantastic plans for what you were going to do in 2020. And so 2020 arrives, and we said, no, we're going to proceed. And so with the help of World Affairs Councils all around the country and other wonderful groups like the Global Leadership Conference, we proceeded, and we interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people, and we met virtually with dozens and dozens of groups who were involved in these questions. And we produced a report, thanks to Harvard University, the Cox Foundation, and some private funders at the end of 2020, so that the new administration, or a repeat of the past administration, would have something to work with and something to think about. We had 10 recommendations. And they ran all the way from changing the mission and mandate of the State Department to changing the name of the Foreign Service. Like you all have changed your name to Global Santa Fe, we had a thought about changing the name as well. We put the 10 recommendations out there, and like you can imagine, some were more popular than others, but by and large, we had a very positive response. Nick Burns then was named, as you all know, to be the U.S. ambassador to China. He left Harvard, so Harvard left us. And we were very, very, very lucky to have Arizona State University volunteer to be our new institutional home. And Ambassador Ries and I, Marcie Ries and I, said, we just can't leave this alone. We just can't leave these 10 recommendations out there and say, we're done, see you later, good luck. And so we decided we were going to try to do something new. And what we did was we took 4 of the 10 recommendations, changed the mission and mandate of the State Department, focus in on professional education and training, look at the personnel system of the State Department, and create for the very first time a diplomatic reserve corps. And we decided, Jim, to do something, as I say, which we think is a first, and that is we hired a legislative writer. And so in each of these chapters, which we call blueprints, there are, for every recommendation, all of the legislation that you would need, all of the change in regulation that you would need, the executive orders you might want to pursue to accomplish these tasks. And so we're hoping that that's what's going to make a difference. Our little philosophy was we wanted to take away all the excuses anybody could think of to not do these things. So if you want to have a diplomatic reserve corps, here's 73 pages of the legislation that would be required to create it. If you'd like to do more in professional education and training, here's a way to do it. And the other thing is, and then I'll stop, we kept to 4 principles throughout. And I think the principles are important, which is that we had a principle said we're going to be transparent. and we were transparent with the Congress. We were transparent with the State Department. We were transparent with everybody who's involved in these things. Secondly, we said we were going to be bipartisan. And so with the help of people on both the Republican and the Democratic side on Capitol Hill, we've had a very good effort to be bipartisan about this. And so that's been very good. Third is the philosophy that we were talking about before, which is the State Department needs change. It needs change in its culture. It needs change in the way it does business. And that we said to, especially the people who are serving today, to put the State Department back into the center of U.S. foreign policy making and execution. That's not some gift that someone gives you. You don't just get it because you're a foreign service officer or a civil service person at the State Department. You have to earn this. And one of the things that we learned in our conversations for the first report was people said, you got to earn these things. And so that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to remind people, number three, that this is an earned effort, not a gift. And third, as I said, we wanted to do this for people who have served, to honor them, to the people who are serving today, and for the people who will, we hope, serve for a long time in the future. And our expectation here was that you, the American public deserves, and the American public expects the highest functioning diplomatic service the United States can have, right? Because we're in a competition around the world. And so you want your diplomats to be the best diplomats in the world. And that's the effort here. And we wanted to produce something that would change the way people do business at the State Department. And I hope that in the phase we're in now, which is an effort to inform and to convince members of Congress especially that here's some things we can do, and to convince and inform people in administration, here's some things we can do that will have the effect we're looking for.
I want to get to at least two or three of the areas of action. But first, when do you think, and why do you think, the Department of State sort of lost its way or began to cede its position as the center of foreign policy to the military or to the intel community?
You know, part of it is events, right? We've fought a lot of wars over the past few years, and as you can understand, when you're in conflict, it's not diplomacy that maybe rises to the top. You know, again, if you'd allow me, I mean, when I took the job of being a special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan in early 2011, we had 100,000 young men and women in Afghanistan. And when you sit around the table at the White House, if you're 100,000 young men and women in Afghanistan, well, the military has a larger say in this, right? And so the job I was given was to try to find some diplomatic way out of this, fine, but you still have to pay attention to the enormous effort and the risk that you're putting those people in. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is I think people became a little bit complacent about this, right? So I'm a foreign service officer, so I deserve these things, right? Or I ought to be in the center of this. And people forgot a little bit about the effort that it took, as I say, to earn these things. And third, third is that the things we learned in talking, especially to our military colleagues, is when I talk about culture change, for example, at the State Department. So in the military, people believe in professional education. They believe that in your career, you're supposed to go improve yourself and get a master's degree and, you know, go to training and do better. And in the Foreign Service, and I believe my colleagues here, retired Foreign Service people, will back me up, is people say, well, I don't want to do training, bad for my career. I'm not taking a year off because I won't get promoted. Right? And so you have to change the incentive system for all those things. So I think it's a combination of things. And so we have to be kind of smarter, and people have to get committed, or recommitted maybe is the best way to say it, is to be the highest functioning, the best diplomatic service in the world.
Is it also part of the nature, though, that the Secretary of State is or has his own crew around him or her and really does not use the resources of the Department of State? I think particularly of Jim Baker, who was widely viewed as a successful Secretary of State, but perhaps was not as popular, say, as George Shultz among the rank and file.
You know, it's over the years, the first Secretary of State I worked for, people always say, I would meet people, especially as I got further on in my career, people, especially people in the political world, and they say, well, you're a holdover from, the last administration. And I would say, yes, I'm a holdover from the Ford administration. Ford was president when I came into the Foreign Service. So I'm a Ford holdover. So I think you have to just learn to live with this, right? If you think about the Secretary of State in my time, you're looking for, if you're an employee at the State Department, you're looking for somebody who's got a great relationship with the White House, who can do fantastic foreign policy, because that's the most important thing here, right? Can they take us to someplace exciting and important? And then can you do something for the institution? And so the effort is always to try to balance these things. And to take Secretary Baker in particular. So Secretary Baker, I thought, in my time, had some of the most fantastic foreign policy that we pursued, right? The reunification of Germany, the first Gulf War. I mean, terrific things that he did. And you know what now? If you ask Jim Baker to say something, endorse something, to help something for the State Department, especially the Foreign Service, he's the first person in mind. And so, I don't know, maybe at the time he was the Secretary of State, he had some people, absolutely. But I'm telling you that now when he looks back on this, he says, the people who worked for me were fantastic. Fantastic.
So tell us a little lighter moment about that anecdote that you had with your good friend Colin Powell about training.
So Colin Powell, who of course we miss a lot now. Colin Powell taught us a lot of things. But among the things he taught us was, he said, Mark, if you're making a pitch here for more training for the State Department, call it professional education, right? Because that's what he thought. So I thought, you'll notice, I'm professional education. So he and I used to do this routine in public, and David may remember, 'cause we did it sometimes in the Congress. And he'd say, Mark, you seem like a pretty senior Foreign Service officer to me. Thank you, I'd say. And he'd say, Mark, how much professional education did you have in your career? And I'd say, well, Mr. Secretary, language training aside, I had 6 weeks of professional education, right, in 30 years. And he would say to me, Mark, I had 6 years of professional education in his sort of 40-year military career. So we do not argue. Please, please, please don't walk out of here saying that we argue in this report or blueprints for 6 years of professional education for the Foreign Service. Not. But somewhere between 6 weeks and 6 years is probably some useful number. What we argue for in the report is a kind of long-term career-long education, really focusing in on early years, the middle years, as the military does so well, just before you become a field grade officer, or an ambassador or a general, and then continuing education throughout. Professional education also, of course, in terms of the Foreign Service, it's language training, right? And so you'll see a lot in the blueprints about focusing in on long-term, hard language training, which, again, many people in this room have done on behalf of the United States. And what incentives do you try to bring to those things? And then the most important, for me anyway, of these recommendations, again, something Powell taught us. When he became Secretary of State, I happened at that time to be the Director General of the Foreign Service. So I was the personnel boss at the State Department. And one of the things that we knew about the military was that every military unit has 15% extra people, they call it a float, for training in transit. So when Secretary Powell came, he asked me, he said, what can I do for you? And I said, I have an answer to your question. I said, we need a float, just like you've had in every unit you ever commanded. He said, okay, let's do it. So we added 1,100 people to the State Department over 3 years. Thanks again to the Congress who funded this, $90 million total. So the department goes up by 1,100 people. Where'd they all go? They went to Iraq, they went to Afghanistan, they went to Colombia. And good, right? But what we learned was that you have to fence that group of people off so that if they go to training, professional education, then they should stay there, right? That's their job while they're in education. And so one of the things we learned, and you'll see in the blueprint, is let's create, the Department of State, we figured the Department of State needs an 8% float. It doesn't actually need 15. I give a lot of credit to the last two administrations. They put a down payment. They put 4% up. So we argue for the other 4 and 4, 8, and then make it a complement and put a legal barrier around it so that it can't be rated again. And so to put some incentive for professional education. Just by the by, so give you some numbers here. Okay, so first think about the Pentagon budget over here. So to add 4% to the State Department, We argue for 250 people a year over 4 years, 1,000 people. It costs $53 million a year, total $212 million, right? That's it. That's the total to bring the number to 8%. So we haven't put anything in this report that's a budget buster, right? We've put things in here that we think make some sense and, in our view anyway, would be a good use of the taxpayers' money.
What are the key points, 3 or 4, that need to be addressed insofar as personnel for the State Department? Because, you talk about adding a number of people, but you're going to have to get congressional
Correct.
approval.
Correct.
So what are the key elements?
On the personnel side, the personnel blueprint's got, as Jim says, lots of things in it. But let me give you 3 or 4. And again, I believe some of this will resonate with colleagues. First, and that is we've got to shrink the amount of time between the time somebody takes the Foreign Service exam and passes it and they get an offer to join the Foreign Service, right? That time is too long. And so we, again, have put in a little budget money.
How long is it when you say that?
Well, it's now like 18, 20 months, right? And so you think about today's job market, and you think about, your children and grandchildren who are looking for jobs. No one's going to wait around 18, 20 months for this. So they got other opportunities. So we put a little bit of money into our blueprint for more people to do the security clearances, right? For more people to do these kinds of things. Second thing is recruiting. And that is, again, there's a small amount of budget increase for recruiting. Why is that? One, because among the things the State Department has to be better at is diversity. And the way you do better at diversity is you do better at recruiting. The more recruiters you have, the more possibility is to bring in a diverse population. So bringing down that time, more recruiting to bring you to more diversity. The other 2 I would mention are we've tried really hard to, say, build in incentives for long-term language training, education, because that's kind of part of that. And then finally, just a 4th one is we've tried very hard also to focus in on opportunities for family members who are traveling, assigned with the person who is assigned as the Foreign Service person, to open up more opportunities for family members to work overseas. And we think that'd be an excellent, excellent way to retain more people, and it would be a great incentive for people to go abroad. So there are many more recommendations in that blueprint, but I'd give you those 3 or 4.
Tell us more about the Diplomatic Reserve Corps, because when I looked at that, I thought, all right, he's asking to increase the number of people in the Foreign Service, and yet on top of that, it looked to me almost like you were trying to create a new organization.
We are. It's exactly right. Well,
as a taxpayer, I'm not so sure about that.
Okay, that's okay. First, let me just say, the Diplomatic Reserve Corps, or the need for a Diplomatic Reserve Corps, is not a new idea. This is not an original idea in this report. This has been around for years. In fact, among the most vocal proponents of a Diplomatic Reserve Corps was the wonderful Secretary of State, Larry Eagleburger, who was a Foreign Service officer, as you recall, and then became the Secretary of State of the United States. And so he always had been for this, and many other people as well. So what we tried to do was say, okay, it's time now to make this operationally relevant and possible. So why? Why is because think about all of the military services. All of them have reserves. Why do they have reserves? They have reserves because you can never predict quite what's going to happen around the world, and because you can't quite know where you might need some new people. And I'll give you 2 examples from the past year and a bit. Number 1, think about, just hold in your minds for a second, the photographs of the evacuation of Kabul. Right? So this is not great pictures. And I want to put a parenthesis here. Number 1, the people who went there and were told to go there and were told to do this work, they were heroic and courageous, right? So give them credit. And number 2, don't forget, they moved 125,000 people in 6 weeks. If you have any idea of what that took, these people did a heroic job. But it was ad hoc, right? It was like coming into this room on a Friday afternoon and say, you, and you, tomorrow you're going to Kabul and you're going to do this job and good luck, right? No, that's what they did. And so we just felt ad hoc isn't going to work anymore, right? Ad hoc is not the way to do this. And so we thought we should have this organization. Second example I would give you, and maybe some of you were caught up in this, right? So during the pandemic, and you can understand why, the number of passport applications, it got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until it was in the hundreds of thousands. Right? And so here you have American citizens who pay their taxes, say, gosh, I'd really like my passport to be renewed. And if there had been a diplomatic reserve corps, you could have assigned people to passport agencies all around the country and said, work on this, right? Let's get this backlog down. And there are lots of other examples as well. And so we thought to ourselves, this is a necessary thing. And so here are the numbers as for you as a taxpayer. And the idea is to do this over 5 years. You spend the first year creating the infrastructure inside the State Department that would be necessary. Because if you just start pouring people into the State Department, as all of you who were there know, what's going to happen? Not going to work. So spend a year getting the structure right. And then over the next 4 years, 4 plus 1, total of 5, for the next 4 years, again, bring in 250 people a year. 250 times 4 is 1,000. Our figure is that it would cost about $8 million in the first year to work on the structure, and that would cost you some money each year on an increasing basis. And in year 6, in other words, when this was all set, this is a $40 million a year operation. For 1,000 people to be your reserves, it costs you about $40 million a year. And we thought this is not a bad amount of money to spend, again, especially compared to some of the other things that get money that gets spent. Two other points. One is that we envision this as a two-way street. Because what's one of the challenges of the State Department? One of the challenges of the State Department is that the State Department is not so well known around the country. Right? We have very few advocates who are in towns all around the United States. And so what if you had reservists who came from all around America? What would they do? You would hope that they would then become ambassadors back to their own communities. And so we have 4 categories of possible reservists. Senior retired Foreign Service and Civil Service people who worked at the State Department. More junior people who worked at the State Department, retired. Senior people who had never worked at the State Department, maybe they were at state government, maybe they were in academics, maybe they had all kinds of skills to bring. And then a 4th category of people also from the public who were maybe more junior, who were just looking for something to do, different to do and to serve their country. And so with those 4 categories, we thought that this might be a pretty interesting experiment. Again, this would take recruiting. It's another possibility for diversity to open up the State Department to lots more different kinds of people. And very importantly, it's a way to get the department's message out to the public.
How's the State Department doing on diversity? I know it was a major effort, but then during the Trump administration, a number of people left, and I think there was truly only a handful of African Americans as ambassadors.
Yeah.
How are you turning that around?
Well,
Or how are they turning it around?
Are they turning this around? So this is a big problem. This is a serious problem, and nobody's been able to solve it yet. And so there's a whole series of questions about why. Because it isn't just African Americans, right? I mean, you think here you are in Santa Fe. If you look at the numbers for Hispanic Americans, these numbers are the same as they were 20 years ago, right? There's been no statistical improvement in kind of the number of Hispanics in the Foreign Service. Why is that? Lots of reasons. I think it has to do a lot with recruiting. I think it has to do with kind of how people think about how they would fit in the service. So one of the recommendations, actually, of the 10 from the Belfer report was what we called put a relentless focus on diversity. And there are lots of recommendations there, a number of which the department has taken on. I don't say they took it on because it was on our report, but good. Right, so there's now a chief diversity officer, Ambassador Gina Abercrombie Winstanley. There's more money for recruiting, and very importantly as well, more outreach to people who are younger, right, in high schools, colleges, so they start thinking a little bit about the State Department. But this is something that this is a long-term struggle, and people have to keep paying attention to it. One of the things you'll notice if you do, I hope you will take a look at this, is Marcie and I said in our introduction that kind of the 2 themes that run throughout all these blueprints. One is this question of diversity, really important, and secondly is this reconnection or connection between the State Department, Foreign Service in particular, and the American public.
We will send a link to both the Belfer report and this to all of you. Marc, you need a champion on Capitol Hill. That's what's really different about your initiative. You are working that. Who are your champions? Yeah. And how are you approaching that?
Well, maybe David can help me here when he comes up. So yes, so we're in a phase 3. We put out this report in September of last year. We went back to the major funder, the wonderful, wonderful, wonderful Unit Chapman Cox Foundation, and we said, okay, here we have this report. Ambassador Ries and I, we're good people, but we don't have a clue really and truly how to now take this and turn it into something that people on Capitol Hill will appreciate. And we would really recommend to you, go get some professionals at this, right, and take this to the next phase. And God bless them, they were prepared to do it. And Arizona State University was prepared to stick with it. Fantastic. And so they went to the American Academy of Diplomacy, wonderful organization, also very helpful in our report. And the Academy bid for this job. And as David knows, they have a lot of people in the Academy who know a lot about Capitol Hill, Mike Van Dusen and Graham Bannerman, the first two in this regard. And so this is now their job. They have taken this money and they have taken this responsibility. And so, we want them to get this job done. The best, and again, they will know better, but the best estimate we have is this is a 2-year project, is that it's a year kind of education committees, and then a year maybe on the floor, House and Senate. And so we have, luckily for us, they have the funding for this. Ambassador Ries and I, Marcie and I, stay involved in it as we're part of the steering group of this. So the question to me now is, do you have a champion today? The answer is no. We're starting that effort. But there's a diplomacy caucus in the Senate. There's a diplomacy caucus in the House. We have met a lot of people, both staff and members, who are interested in these things. We have a lot of particular interest in the Reserve Corps because people get that, right? The Marine Corps Reserve, the Army, people get Reserve Corps. And so we're hoping we'll make some progress.
And hopefully Kirsten is taking notes and will take it back to USGLC.
USGLC has been a wonderful partner.
So, in this audience, and you know this as well as anyone, World Affairs Council members are engaged in topics like this. What can these 90 people do?
So here's the good thing about being retired, right? I can now ask you, without violating any laws, I can now ask you to just be interested in this, and if you read it and if you find it motivating, I hope you'll be in touch with, this is really now an effort to be in touch with the congressman, with a senator, with somebody who, might be able to help us here. So I hope you will do that, and I hope you'll have us back maybe a year from now. We can report on where we are and go from there.
So before we invite your colleagues and my friends up, anything that we missed that you'd like to underscore?
No, thank you very much. Just thank you very much for this chance.
Good. All right, so let's invite David and Deborah.
You want me to move?
No, you stay there, I think, and I go over here. You'll take a microphone. Okay.
We got the computers with us?
Oh, my goodness. That's not fair.
That's not fair.
PowerPoint.
All righty, so what we've suggested is that each one of our ambassadors here have 5 minutes. Well, I changed it. Deborah, welcome. Oh, I guess let me just do a very quick introduction of both of you fellows. Yeah, although everyone knows Deborah Jones. So,
Everyone knows someone named Deborah.
so I don't know what it is about the 30 years, but Ambassador Jones retired as a career minister after 34 years of service. And one of the reasons I thought she would be so good to have on this panel is because she has worked in the Middle East. And one of the areas that we want to talk about is security and the ability and authority that ambassadors have to really run their own embassies. Ambassador Jones was ambassador to Kuwait from 2008 to 2011. She followed as ambassador to Libya after the tragic death of Ambassador Chris Stevens. And she has served in Istanbul. She was the deputy chief of mission in UAE, served in my favorite country, Tunisia, and is now the chairman of Ahmadis, the remarkable organization that does educational outreach throughout the Middle East. So good to have you with us. And then the man from Capitol Hill, David Killion is vice chairman of our organization, and he served in the Obama administration as ambassador to UNESCO for about 5 years. And of course, that's a multilateral organization. Instead of working in Kuwait, he was in Paris. And you know, they can talk. Deborah, who is your chef? And who is your chef? But we'll do that for another time. But the reason that I really wanted him on this panel is that he served in the Hill for a number of years and was specifically responsible as staff director, senior professional staff member of the U.S. House Committee on Foreign Affairs. So he really oversaw, guided the congressional work over the State Department operations and multilateral international organizations. So he brings a wealth of experience. So welcome to both of you. So Deborah, if you would start with your 5.5 minutes on how do you view the report?
Thank you. Well, there are many things that I agree with in the report. There are some things that generationally, we all have our views on some of the report, but I think the objective is correct. Let me just, because you raised the Middle Eastern and the security aspect, let me talk a little bit about that at the outset. I do think it is extremely important that ambassadors in the field, as chiefs of mission, be given full authority to make determinations and decisions for their staff, for the operations of the mission in the field. We are the chief security officer at post. No one else has the combination of information that we have, which is not only from the intelligence that we're receiving every day, if we're staying on our toes and reading it, but the fact is that, intelligence that comes from satellite needs to be matched by human intelligence on the ground and a good knowledge of what is happening on the ground. And I think that, I like to tell people in after the Arab Spring, a lot of people were caught up, as I say, in the endorphins of revolution. Americans love a good revolution that it leads to democracy and good stuff. And I think we were so caught up in what we thought was a great possibility at the time that I think sometimes that could blur judgment. But I will only say that I was very appreciative of the fact that when I was in Libya, and again, you're working in consultation. By the time I got to Libya, we had 89 combat Marines guarding the perimeters of the mission. Of course, you're always fighting the last war, right? I mean, that's the case there. And of course, at one point when we had Grad missiles, when things broke down and we were actually being hit and shelled on the post, we were having discussions. But when the captain of the Marine group that was there with us came to me and said, "Ma'am, I can't keep my men safe anymore." That was the moment when I went back to Washington, and we had all been trying to stay there as long as we could. And even when we evacuated, there were people in Washington who still said, "Well, couldn't you just leave a group here? Couldn't you just leave the agency, for example? Couldn't you leave, And we said no, because they won't have the security. They'll be vulnerable, and it's not worth losing the ear of a Marine or a hand or a limb for a political situation that right now, and as we've seen over the years, has still not worked its way through. And so when I made that decision that we were going to withdraw, nobody at the White House on down pushed back. I mean, there were some people at lower levels with the agency and others who said, we could really keep a clandestine thing. But no, the decision was made to pull out. And then it was a matter of the mechanics on how we were going to do that. And there was some disagreement about that. But we actually went, and this is, I think, where experience in the Middle East, and I was in Baghdad during the Iran-Iraq War. I was in Syria during the invasion of Iraq, and, I'd served in a lot of places. And this is when old-fashioned, look at the situation on the ground, in the air, consult with your military advisors, consult with the agency, with all of the sources you have at post. And we said, we don't have a permissive environment. We can't get out by air. We can't be airlifted out. We can't get to the sea to be taken out by ship because there were barricades all put up. So we went out the old-fashioned way, but because of my experience, we went out overland. And because of my experience in the region, we knew, and we'd known from the previous fighting, it was Ramadan. And we knew that during Ramadan, the Libyans were stopping. They would fight and then they would stop for several hours to eat before Fajr, before the sun came up again. So the decision was, great, get everyone ready, get our motorcade ready. At 3 a.m. on the dot, we are leaving this compound, and that's when the fighting stopped. And we took a convoy, and we had a lot of support. But we took a convoy of 39 armored vehicles that cost the U.S. taxpayer about $250,000 a pop, and 159 people, and we got everyone out. Overland, we went into the mountains. In the west, we came out through Tunisia. The agency had arranged for the Tunisian national security forces to line all the roads. We got out. We got lifted out to Italy. We arrived at a U.S. base. And the guy who was the commander of the base was someone I had taught when I was the national security advisor at the Naval War College. So that's why career is good, and the ties are good, and experience is great. So I will say that. That I really applaud that on the report. And you've got to really hold ambassadors to that too, though. You've got to hold people to their responsibilities and tell them, we all know these people are in your charge. You are responsible. And you've got to shoulder that. The buck stops there, in my opinion.
Thank you. Mark, thank you, Deborah. And I have a copy of the letter. I won't pull it out. But Mark, tell us about I didn't know about the presidential letter that every ambassador gets.
Yeah. So everybody here who carries this title will be very happy to get this letter because, as Deborah says, this is a letter from the President of the United States that says, with a big exception, right, all those military forces deployed under a combatant commander, as Deborah said, this is your responsibility. Your responsibility for everything, for the people, for the property, for the policy, for the whole deal. And whether it's a multilateral organization or a bilateral or an embassy, you're responsible. And so one of the things that we felt, perhaps arrogantly, and you may consider that's okay with me, but we thought, it's been years since this letter has really been updated. It's been years since people have tried, as Deborah said, to increase some of the generational questions about technology and ways of doing business. So we decided that we would rewrite the letter for the president and provide a draft. And so in the report, there's a draft. And it says, here, think about this. And among the most important things that we said was that when it comes to security, you have to trust the ambassador of the United States of America. And that there is, as all of us know, this balance between risk management and risk avoidance. And you cannot have the highest functioning, best diplomacy in the world if all you think about is risk avoidance. Because people have to be out there. People have to be doing this job. And it means people from time to time, I am sorry to say, are going to get hurt. And the people of the United States of America have to recognize that as a price to be paid. Now that said, you got to pay attention, as Deborah so eloquently said, to risk management. Right? There are times when it's enough, and you got to do what she did. The other thing I would say, if you'd allow me, is that over the past 2 years, the American Academy of Diplomacy, in trying to support ambassadors, went to Congress and said, we need to change the language, and I don't mean to be too inside of baseball here, but there's something called the Accountability Review Board. The Accountability Review Board has basically been, over the years, a place where people play gotcha to the ambassador of the United States of America who makes a decision. Right? And you should have done this, you should have done that, what about this, what about that? All important, please don't get me wrong. But it had become a negative. And the Academy did what we are now trying to do. They redrafted the ARB's legislation, and over a 2-year period of really hard work in the Congress and with the Congress, in this last national defense, in the NDAA, in the State Department authorization, they won this battle, and the language is now changed about the ARB. And the fact that it's changed makes me think, if they can do it, maybe we can do it too.
Let me add a humorous note, though, just because that was so intense, but our titles as ambassadors, it's an old title, blame the French, sorry for the French people here, but extraordinary and plenipotentiary, right? So you have all this authority to represent the president. And I'll never forget when I was the ambassador to Kuwait, and I was the only woman off, of course, as ambassador, going off to an all-male wedding. And my oldest daughter was visiting me, and she had the usual disdain for authority that, children of poobahs have, I guess. And as I went to go in, I said, Anna, just wait in the car for 10 minutes. I'll be in and out. And so when I came out, she said, so, Mama, tell me, how did it feel to have everyone kissing those plenipotentiary buttocks?
So on that note, thank you for that.
Thank you, Jim. And I want to
If you'll hold the mic up a little bit
I want to
more.
start by saying that I feel kind of outnumbered because I'm on this stage with Foreign Service ambassadors and Foreign Service, not just on the stage, but Santa Fe is a Foreign Service town. And I was not a Foreign Service officer. It's not.
Here, take this.
Yeah.
Take that one.
Thanks, Deborah.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, and I really had to go back, so I took some notes. I really had to go back in my career to think about this blueprint and what I like about it and what I don't like about it. Before I was a politically appointed ambassador, I worked in the trenches, in the dark and dirty political side of U.S. foreign policy. First for a congressman who was a member of the Appropriations Subcommittee that funded the State Department, then as a Clinton appointee in the Bureau of Legislative Affairs, and finally as a senior staffer for Tom Lantos on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where I was responsible for State Department oversight. I was responsible for managing the State Department Authorization Act. And so as such, with Tom Lantos in the lead, I fought many, many battles to advance the same ideas that Marc's bringing to you today, including the 1,100 Foreign Service officer for Colin Powell. We had to fight Henry Hyde to get that for you guys. And I love this blueprint. I think you guys did an incredible job. I support almost all of it. I agree we have to increase the number of Foreign Service officers. I agree we have to expand education and training. I agree with the proposals to reform the personnel system. I certainly agree with the Chief of Mission, expanded authority. But you probably won't be surprised that I disagree with some of the proposals in the blueprint aimed at reducing the leadership and role of political appointees. If you could only do it for Republican administrations, I'd be in favor of it. I would say that...
Thanks for helping the bipartisan, nonpartisan. That's right.
I would say that much of the work of foreign policy is political work. Interagency battles are political battles. Even battles between State Department bureaus on decision memos for the Secretary are political battles. And I would say to Marc, let us, the political appointees, do a lot of the dirty political work for you. I understand and support the mandate for creating the position of Undersecretary of Political Affairs to only be for the Foreign Service. But I don't support the mandate of 75% of Assistant Secretaries being from the Foreign Service. I don't support a mandate for 90% of U.S. ambassadors to be Foreign Service officers. And finally, I don't support the mandate that the State Department should, with rare exceptions, chair the Assistant Secretary level interagency policy committee meetings that in most administrations are chaired by the National Security Council. I actually think that part of what makes the U.S. Foreign Service more dynamic and more innovative than many other governments' diplomatic services, and I saw this when I was at UNESCO because we had 195 countries with their diplomatic services there. I think that the partnership with the political appointees helps to make this dynamism, helps to make our Foreign Service as great as it is. I had an exceptional Foreign Service officer as my DCM in Paris. Her name was Kathy Kavalik. And now she's the ambassador to Romania for the United States. And you know what she told me was the most formative experience in her entire Foreign Service career? It was early, when she was very young, when she was a junior officer, and she worked for a great political ambassador to Moscow, Bob Strauss. And Bob continued to be her mentor until his death in 2014. And in what Foreign Service would you get that kind of a formative experience with Bob Strauss besides ours? And, I would note that there's been some other great political ambassadors posted to Moscow, including John Quincy Adams, James Buchanan, Averell Harriman, and Michael McFaul, to name just a few. And I would also say, from my experience, I had to go way back to when I was working for legislative affairs in the Clinton administration. I was a legislative management officer. And I mainly represented a very non-traditional part of our foreign policy, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And at that time, it was headed by a political appointee, one of the greatest international human rights lawyers of our time, the Yale Law School Dean Harold Koh. And I witnessed over and over how Koh's stature and his relationship with Secretary Albright and with both of the Clintons enabled him to advance the interests of that bureau in a way that perhaps few Foreign Service officers would have been able to do. Also during the Clinton administration, I worked with another great legal scholar, a political appointee to the State Department, a Santa Fe resident, one of the few political foreign policy actors here, David Sheffer. He was the first ever ambassador for war crimes. And David literally helped to invent the tribunals for Rwanda and Yugoslavia, and finally the Rome Statute creating the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And he could do this, as I witnessed, because I worked very closely with him, because of his legal expertise, but also because he was so close to Secretary Albright. And he had her confidence. He'd been her top advisor in New York at the UN. And it's hard for me to imagine how a career FSO at that time and place could have substituted for the role David played in innovating this area of our foreign policy. And then just turning last to the interagency, I went way back again. A story came to me, a real-world example of why I don't think I favor putting the state, maybe you could convince me, putting the State Department in the lead. I was working at the working level, I was the top negotiator for the Department of State with Hill staffers during the Clinton administration over the terms of a very seminal, groundbreaking, heavily impactful piece of foreign policy legislation called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And our State Department position was to seek some flexibility in the Act's automatic sanctions regime. And we even wanted to go as far as to issue a veto threat, because that's how you get movement on Capitol Hill. And if we didn't get these changes that we needed. Our main interagency opponent arguing against taking a hard line with the Hill was none other than the First Lady's office, represented by their chief of staff at the time, Milan Revere, who was fierce. And she feared the optics of issuing a veto threat. Luckily, the National Security Human Rights Director, Eric Schwartz, was fantastic. He did a brilliant job of explaining and presenting the State Department's position and finally laying down the law with the First Lady's office. We issued the veto threat, we got the changes we needed, and everyone, State, the Hill, the First Lady's office, the NGOs, were ultimately satisfied with the bill. I'm not sure how an interagency policy committee chaired by the State Department could have faced down the First Lady's office in that case. The Clinton White House basically did its job and, in my view, protected states and the nation's interests. And just a couple of other things. I hope you will ask me about international organizations. I think it's a place where this Foreign Service needs to do a lot better and to get trained a lot better and to have a better advancement for being great at international organizational affairs. And I also hope you'll ask me about the situation on the Hill today and how Mark can get most of the stuff I like passed, because I'm very good at that and I have some ideas.
Good. Thank you, David. So let me just read a quote from George Kennan before I ask both of our career ambassadors to respond about this issue of political appointees. George Kennan: it would be desirable that it be regarded as the normal and primary source of appointment to ambassadorial positions in the senior positions Department of State that be established on the British pattern, wholly divorced from political affiliation or influence. Mark?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, David, first of all, thank you for everything you did for the State Department. We were talking at lunch about kind of our mutual admiration for Tom Lantos, and I don't know how many of you had the good fortune to know of him or work with him. All of us had the good fortune to work closely with him, and in a long line of people sort of I miss, not just personally, but the kind of legislator he was and the kind of person he was. It was an honor to work with him, and so that's a good thing we all share. So let me just make some comments about your very important points. And first of all, I appreciate all the things that you like about the report. And yes, if you've got some ideas, we'll be back to you. So let's first of all take the question of political appointees who go abroad to represent the United States as ambassador. So I make 2 points. One, we were never, not ever, interested in that number being zero. George Kennan might have, but we were never interested in that number being zero, because I think actually one of the great things about the United States of America is that people from outside the State Department get to come and do represent the United States of America. I mean, you mentioned Bob Strauss. You know, I mean, you think about when I was the Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, you know, Felix Rohatyn, who represented us in France, right? Pamela Harriman before. You know, Felix Rohatyn, you know, huge Wall Street success. But what made him great there was he was Austrian born. He'd fled the Nazis through France, right? He was fantastic. I wouldn't have had anybody as a foreign service officer who could have done that work. But here's the thing. So we put in the first Belfer report 90% foreign service, 10% political. And our goal was to just sort of make everybody think, well, gosh, let's talk about this. And as I said to many people on the Hill, I'm now prepared to negotiate this, right? So if you don't think 90 is a good number, how about 80, right? So the idea is to just lower the number one. And number two, you'll also see the question of quality and competence and ready to do the job. So if you say to me, would you take 20% of American ambassadors abroad who were political appointees, and you promised me that all 20% would be as qualified as David to represent the United States abroad, I'd say that's a deal, right? Absolutely, 100%, I'll take it. And I think we'd be better off for this. My challenge is we don't have people as qualified as you, and we don't have people who end up, and this is not a Republican or Democratic thing, believe me, this happens in both administrations for both parties, and so this is a question of who's qualified. So 20% of you, 20% of Bob Strauss, 20% of John C. Whitehead, right? Martin Indyk, absolutely 100%, take it every day. Third thing, and that's on the question of the 75%. So we chose 75% as our number for people at the assistant secretary level precisely because it gives you enough space to have a David Sheffer. It gives you enough space to have qualified political appointees. And again, this to me is just a way to say, hey, we ought to think about these questions, right? And you want to be 60-40, I'm listening, right? But we want quality human beings to be in these jobs. All of Henry Kissinger's assistant secretary level people were career foreign service or civil service officers, right? People don't think about Henry Kissinger that way, but he had all that level, all career. So again, it's about who is doing the work, and we wanted to say, stop. Let's think about this question. Third is, and you didn't mention this, but I want to. You're exactly right about this relationship about the Hill and representing the United States abroad. I hope that those of you also who are ambassadors will agree with me. So being confirmed, right, by the Senate of the United States to go abroad is sort of a pain in the neck sometimes. A lot of papers to fill out, takes a long time, sometimes not so pleasant, but when you are confirmed by the Congress, you have an extra special kind of touch for representing the United States abroad, right? You don't, I mean, the executive branch is the executive branch, and you don't really represent the Congress. But you're able to say, I represent the United States of America, and the Senate voted for me. And it also means that when you come back and go to see a senator, you're not stabbed, right? You say, you voted for me, so could you help me, please? And that's a really important thing and a huge thing. On the interagency, we'll just agree to disagree about that. We wanted to say, and again, I go back to the point I made when I was responding to Jim. It's not a gift. It's not a gift to be given, so chair all these committees. It's something to earn. And I would hope that if we were here 5 years from now, that you'd say, okay, you earned this right? That you earned the capacity to do this. And two more things, the last two things that you mentioned. One, on international organizations, it's right. This is a specialized diplomatic skill. And our friends at the American Academy of Diplomacy put a report out, actually, written by Joellen Powell, who was one of our authors here, on doing exactly that, increasing the capacity to represent the United States in international organizations. And we incorporated it by reference into our reports. And then finally, as you say, if you've got some ideas, we're listening.
Great. Deborah, I want to ask you, because you were kind enough to send me a panel discussion you did a few weeks ago, and you talked about sort of the obstacles coming from the institution. And either you or one of the other people in the panel said we have met, using POGO, we have met our enemy and it is us. So when you look at what's in this report, is the rank and file ready to change? Because this report is not the first to try to tackle some of these issues.
Yeah. Well, I do think the rank and file it has to change. The world has changed around it. And for example, too, to kind of link these two things in, when I entered the State Department, I was told when I was bidding, when we put out for our next assignments, avoid all bureaus that begin with I or O, which was oceans, then science, which was the international relations and the UN, international organizations, and go for the regional bureaus. That's the place where policy is made. That's the big deal. And I think that those then became kind of enclaves of, and it's hard for me to say this fully because I'm a female and, I don't know what it would be like not to be a female because I've never been anything but a female in that organization. So I have nothing to compare it to. And I managed, but I have quite a bit of chutzpah, as you can probably guess. But I think that the world has changed and the issues have changed. And around that, we realize, as Mark has said, we need people who have expertise in areas that are not necessarily the political things. But Jim, I do want to hop to the other, because we had talked about that before. And I think people are going to have to get over themselves in deciding that I look at you, I hear your name, and I've already got you tabbed for failure. And no matter how much good you do, when you screw up, because we all screw up, I'm going to say, I knew that would happen because of who you are. And instead, we have to anticipate success and encourage it. But what I was going to say is that on the political side, and I would only say this, Dave, on some of this, and let me just take one very specific example because I know it well, because I was the office director for Arabian Peninsula and Iran when we were prepping to invade Iraq. Mm-hmm. So in our system, we follow the political will of the leadership. In that case, and it was an anomaly, I would say, in some cases, because we had a president, a vice president, a secretary of defense, Wolfowitz, and one other, who's now at Georgetown, who probably, if you took them each in a separate room and said, why are we going into Iraq, you would get 5 or 6 different answers about it. So the policy was there was this big need to respond, but the policy wasn't really, really clear. And what happened in that circumstance, because we do follow our political leadership, they took a shot, and Mark, you were there for all of this too. They took a shot at it, and guess what? Things went belly up. Mm-hmm. When things went belly up and weren't working, right, that's when they came back to the professionals, the diplomats, and said, guess what, you got to fix this. Okay, Iraq's not perfect, but it's viable now. And the fact is, after all those other things failed because people were operating on the basis of political ideas or notions that were sometimes in competition with each other, and sometimes, I will say this too, in the absence of a strategy, in the absence of national strategy, the tactical becomes strategic. And that means the military, people turn it over. Bush turns over to the military. And by the way, I like W a lot as a person, but it goes to the military because they're very good at tactics. Mm-hmm. And they're looking for a strategy from us. But when things go well, at least you have the expertise and you do have the continuity and you do have people at the regional level in the regional bureaus, I'm not talking necessarily about the others, that have the relationships with the leaders. We have the language. We have the time on the ground. We can tell you, you know what, we know what you want, and we might be able to fine-tune it to bring it a little bit closer to what you want, because we know what works and doesn't work, because we've been around.
Well, let's give a great hand for our panel. And again, thank all of you for coming, and we will put a link to the studies on our website.
Good.
Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.